Now that you've seen how new products develop, let's talk a little bit about the success or failure of new products. Now, in order to start thinking about this, one of the things we have to understand is that companies really need to rely on new products in order to stay relevant and stay alive. But there's a huge financial risk that can come with any new product. And understanding exactly what new means is really difficult because there isn't one definition to identify that a product is new. And of course, there's different degrees of what we would call newness. So, the way we can think of how new a product is to the marketplace is really just by comparing it to the existing products. And a product can be considered new if it is in some form functionally different from an existing product. And this could come about from something as simple as introducing a new features to a product, or sometimes it can be completely revolutionizing an industry by introducing something that doesn't exist at all in the marketplace. So there's different degrees of what we will call newness. But one thing that companies really need to be aware of when we talk about this idea of new, especially when we are creating newness to an existing product, is the concepts of feature bloat and feature fatigue. Now, these two terms are kind of interesting. So, if we think of feature bloat, it's really the tendency to add unnecessary features or functionality to a product that are not really beneficial to consumers and they add to product cost. But we can see oftentimes consumers may think that they want these things. So, if we look at our concept over here on this figure with the idea of customer satisfaction versus the number of features, we kind of see consumers' reaction when we talk about feature bloat. That initially, as I told them, there's going to be more features, nice, but I wish I could do more. We add more features. I'm glad they added this. We add more features. It's just what I needed. And we keep going to the point where we see this bloat that causes fatigue to happen in the product with consumers, where we see this turn. Okay, it's not a big deal. Now I'm overwhelmed. Oh, I've got to look at the manual, and now I just can't even figure out the one thing that I bought this product for. So we see this relationship between feature bloat. We're having way too many features start entering, and now it turns into fatigue, where fatigue occurs because consumers give more weight to the capability and less weight to the usability before using a product than after they use the product. So think about that for a second, that before we use a product, we put more weight on all of the things that the product can do. But once we start using the product, it's less about all of the things that it actually does and more about what I'm actually using it for and how usable the product is for what my needs are. So consumers tend to choose overly complex products that do not maximize satisfaction in the end, and it results in this concept of feature fatigue, which is the annoyance and the reduced likelihood to actually repurchase the product. So that's something we have to be aware of when we are creating these new versions of product. Now, when we think of newness from that consumer perspective, we can think of this in three kind of ways. One is to look at it as continuous innovation. So in the case of continuous innovation, we see that consumers, they don't really need to learn new behaviors when we're adding these features to a product. So the strategy doesn't really include having to re-educate users, but to generate consumer awareness that this new feature is available. It's kind of this new and improved product that they want to be aware of. So that would be your continuous innovation. Consumers can also see it as dynamically continuous innovation. And in this case, only really minor changes are needed in the consumer behavior. And from a strategy standpoint, it's really to educate prospective buyers on the product's benefits, advantages, and the proper use. So in this case, it's likely a new version that isn't just new features, but substantial new features or a new kind of way of using it. But we're highlighting that you've got a better version of your product, and we're going to highlight those benefits, advantages, and how to actually use this version properly. So a good example here is when Swiffer, which initially started out as just um, the dusting cloths, when they introduced the wet jet, which had the tank of water that you could add onto it, consumers were aware what Swiffer was, but this new version with new features, we had to actually educate them a bit on, but they were using it in the same manner. And then from a consumer perspective, we can have discontinuous innovation. So in this case, consumers have to learn an entirely new consumption pattern. So here we have to gain initial consumer awareness. So this is something that is completely kind of new to them, and educating consumers for both the benefits, the proper use of this innovative product, it can cost us millions of dollars. It's almost like coming out with something entirely brand new that they're not aware of at all. So in this case, there's a lot of effort and a lot of dollars that companies are needing to spend. So let's look at these a little bit more closely. So if we look at the continuous innovation, we see it requires no new learning. It then, for examples, we can see new improved shaver, a detergent, or a new toothpaste version. So maybe you've added whitening or maybe a new flavor. And then from that strategy point of view, you're going to gain consumer awareness and wide distribution. If we go to that dynamically continuous innovation, it disrupts consumers' normal routine, but it does not require totally new learning. An electric toothbrush from a regular toothbrush, LED HD TVs from whatever the previous version was, and then even the introduction of smartphones each year when we see new ones. So we're advertising the points of difference and the benefits that consumers are getting in terms of the marketing strategy. And then this discontinuous innovation, so it is going to require new learning and consumption patterns by consumers, something like a wireless router, digital video recorder, an electric car. So EVs is a big thing. We're having to educate consumers through product trial and actual personal selling, so giving them more personalized attention. So you can see that depending on the level of newness of the product from the consumer's perspective, the strategy that we have to use as marketers has to differ as well. Now, we can also think of newness from an organizational perspective. So, the previous ways of looking at newness were from the consumer perspective, but let's think of it from an organization. So the first thing that we could have is what would be called a product line extension. And we see these actually all the time in the marketplace. So a product line extension, typically little risk going to be involved in it because it's simply just an addition to what already exists. So if we think about, for instance, Red Bull, when they introduced their sugar-free line of flavors, that would be a product line extension. It still fits in the same product category. We're just adding to that line by having some new version of it. So little risk here, incremental improvement of that existing product. Then we can go into a brand extension. So here we see a much more significant jump in the innovation of the product. So it involves putting that brand on a new product into an unfamiliar marketplace. So a good example of this we could say is with Arm & Hammer, and they've done this many times. So Arm & Hammer started off as baking soda used in the kitchen. But as they knew that consumers were using it for other things like washing their clothes or actually brushing their teeth, they came out with a number of brand extensions. Now, when that baking soda company took their brand and extended it into toothpaste, a new product category, that would be a brand extension. And this is risky because consumer perceptions of that brand can make it difficult for them to get the benefits of the new product. They may not understand that baking soda whitens your teeth because they're used to baking soda being an ingredient in foods that has certain properties to it. So it can be difficult sometimes for consumers to actually get that. And we need to be conscious of that. And then companies can do a true innovation. So in this case, this is something entirely new being introduced, nothing to do with the brand at all. So if we saw that one of these companies went out and introduced a 3D printer, it doesn't exist really in the marketplace, but it's something totally new for them. That would be a radical or a true innovation that becomes something entirely new for them. Highest level of risk in terms of newness. So now that we have this understanding of what makes a product new, why do we see that new products actually fail? What are the most common reasons that we see that a strong number of products don't make it past their first year of introduction into the marketplace? So one of the biggest reasons is insignificant points of difference. So remember, we talk all the time about point of differentiation. What's the competitive advantage that you have? Well, if we don't have those points of difference from our competitors, then it makes it kind of less interesting to consumers. Why switch from what is already existing and what they're already purchasing? So this is the single most important factor that enables a new product to really defeat our competitors. We have to have superior characteristics that deliver these unique benefits to the ultimate consumer. And it has to be important enough for a consumer to switch from those competing substitutable products. So let's say, for example, that you are drinking a sugar-free energy drink that has artificial ingredients in it, and then we see that, okay, Red Bull came out with its new Total Zero. Why would I switch? They have the same properties. But we see that Red Bull is now using monk fruit in their Total Zero, getting away from those artificial sweeteners. That could be something that is a point of difference that is enough to make you actually switch from a substitutable competitor. Another reason is incomplete market and product protocol. So here, that product protocol clearly will define how an offering would be satisfying a consumer's wants and needs within its target market. And if we don't have it clearly defined how those needs and wants are going to actually be met with your product, then we don't design a product that really aligns with what they need. So without a proper market and product protocol that's aligned with your target market, you're likely going to have some issues and not succeed. Failure to satisfy your customers' needs on the critical factors. So, this factor really stresses that problems on a few critical factors can really kill your product for you. So, you might have a great product that has a point of differentiation, but if it doesn't meet the needs that are considered the critical factors. So think about your evaluative criteria, the things that your product must have in your decision-making process. If the product is not meeting those needs for its target market, then that's going to be a problem. Next one we see is simple bad timing. So the product is maybe introduced too soon, maybe it's introduced too late into product development, or we see that really consumers' tastes are just shifting too fast for you to meet when they want this type of product for. So that does happen, unfortunately. That's why you have to make sure that you're aligning with what's going on in the marketplace and consumers' demands. No economical access to your buyers. So remember that there's over 40,000 new CPG products that are introduced every single year. And costs for things like slotting fees, so the cost of getting shelf space within stores, those are needed in order for you to gain access and maintain access in retailers to your actual consumer. And those fees can be actually high. So if you don't have that budget allocated and you can't buy that shelf space, you don't have a way to actually access your consumers. So that can be very problematic for you. Another reason is poor execution of your actual marketing mix. And this can cause products to fail if any one of our marketing elements is just poorly executed. Anything from our promotional elements, which we'll see later, or even pricing just being off, those can really cause a lot of problems. And then little market attractiveness can be another problem that leads to failure. So in this case, often new product managers are looking for large and growing target markets with real buyer needs. And then we see when we have these smaller niche markets, that target market might actually be too small and too competitive for your actual product. So in that case, the market attractiveness was just off. You didn't necessarily choose the right target market to actually go after. And the last one is poor product quality. So this often happens when your product just hasn't gone through adequate testing. Believe it or not, this happens all the time. And the cost for poor quality can actually be huge. So think about the labor, materials, the expenses that are needed to go in and fix a problem with product quality once it's already been developed. That's huge and just ends up in lost sales, profits, and ultimately no gain in market share or potentially loss of market share if you already have some form of existing product. So, those are kind of the key reasons we see that new products fail in the marketplace and things we want to be aware of as we introduce new products.